Hello biology students, apologies that I can't be with you in person today, but I'm hoping that this video will help you along with today's class. This material is not covered in your test, or sorry, in your quiz tomorrow, but we do need to cover it so that we don't fall behind. I still hope you'll pay attention. Today we're going to be looking at the circulatory system, and I just want to start by asking you, what actually gets your heart rate increasing? What gets your heart racing? You may think of things like, scary movies. Some people love roller coasters. Okay, or exercise. All of these things get our heart rate increasing, and for different reasons as well. Today we're going to start by looking at some things, basically what is a circulatory system and what different types of circulatory system exist. Our big idea for this entire unit, as we've already mentioned, is that the complex structures within these systems reflect and enhance their overall function. So structure and function. And again, our enduring question is, we're going to see how complex, we're going to start to scratch the surface of how complex the circulatory system of animals is. And we want to know, does that point towards the power of evolution or the intelligence of a designer? You know, this is a plastinated model of the hand. I showed you one in our last class, or a previous class, of the lung, and all the capillaries in the lung. This is one showing the network of blood vessels in your hand. And it's absolutely amazing, the density and the coverage of these blood vessels, especially in the tips of your fingers. It's remarkable how dense this network is. So our objectives today, sorry for the one chunky one in the middle, but we're going to talk about why we need circulation, the basic functions and the basic structures, really, of a circulatory system. And we're then going to compare and contrast some different types of systems and look at how closed circulatory systems in particular can vary in complexity. And lastly, we're going to look specifically at two-circuit closed circulatory systems, because that's the one we have, and we're going to look at how blood is pumped in those. Okay, just briefly, because a lot of this stuff we will cover in more depth, particularly with the last objective. So why do we need complexity? Why don't we just have a floating ball of cells and without a system? Without a circulatory system, because it's complex. We need all these additional structures, a heart, all these blood vessels, all of that. So why do we need that? Well, the problem is, if you want a big organism, okay, if you increase in size, like here, if you just have one big cell, your surface area is very low. Okay, you only have access to this outside here, that outside, and three more. Okay, to reach the center of this cube is going to take a very long time, okay, or it's going to be impossible. So what we have is, instead, a whole bunch of different cells, okay? But what you then need to have is a way of getting what you need inside, okay, inside these little spaces. So you could just have them floating in a fluid, okay, but again, that means you then have to wait for all your good substances from the outside to diffuse inside. Instead, what you'll see is a network of blood vessels, okay, or vessels that will go in between all of these little gaps, okay, and fill a lot of these spaces. Not necessarily every single one, but they'll make sure that there is very good coverage to the cells in the body. Okay, each cell needs to have its needs met, which means it has to have ready access to a delivery of what it needs and a way to get rid of what it does not need anymore. Simple organisms like a sea sponge, okay, they are not very complex. They are not that large an organism. Okay, they're not really thick, if you think about it. So they do not need a circulatory system. Okay, they're only a couple of cells thick, so they can get away with just having water flow in here. Okay, and because they're very, very thin, what they need can just diffuse through that outer layer. Okay, so they don't really need a circulatory system. But to be any larger or more complex, you need to have a way to deliver things throughout the body. Just take a quick moment to think about, okay, we've already studied digestive and the respiratory system so far. How does the circulatory system interact with them? What gets taken to the cells of those systems? What gets taken away? Hopefully you'll be able to remember that in your digestive system, your circulatory system is going to carry, well, if you think about it, those enzymes. So CCK and secretin, okay, those are both carried, those are hormones carried in the blood. So your circulatory system is needed there. More obviously, around the villi. Okay, around each villi you have those blood vessels which are going to absorb your nutrients, okay, and carry those away. In your respiratory system, this one's probably a bit easier. You know that your circulatory system is needed to carry around the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. Okay, if you don't have those, if you don't have blood, your respiratory system is kind of pointless. Okay, so our circulatory system kind of ties a lot of our other systems together. Okay, it is what unites them. It's the road through which all other materials will travel. So like we just mentioned, some functions: it delivers oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body. It transports nutrients, so the good stuff that we absorb. It transports hormones, so it lets different parts of the body, through hormones, it lets them communicate. Okay, it carries our immune cells, so our little soldiers in our body that will fight off diseases. Okay, those aren't made everywhere. Okay, they're made in certain parts of the body, they are housed in certain parts, and through the blood, they will go to where you need them. Your circulatory system will take waste away, so not just carbon dioxide, but other harmful chemicals, okay, that are produced from different cells for different reasons. It'll take those to the liver or to the kidneys, where your body can then try and get rid of them. And lastly, it regulates thermal energy. You may notice that when this is your face, when it's warm, when you've been exercising, you may notice that your cheeks get red. Okay, this is not an embarrassed person. This is someone with red cheeks because they've been exercising so much. That's because your body is moving the warm blood to the surface of the skin, okay, where it can be cooled by the air and by the sweat. Okay, so your circulatory system helps you cool down. This is I believe a jackrabbit. Forgive me if I got it wrong. But you'll notice his big ears here. You can actually almost see through them. They're incredibly thin. In this ear is a network of blood vessels. And this rabbit uses those blood vessels to cool down. So we have warm blood being pumped up to the ears. It's going to interact with the cool breeze, and then hopefully when it comes back down, it'll be cooler. Not cold, but cooler at least. So it helps the rabbit cool down slightly. It's a similar thing that'll happen with elephants to some extent. So we're going to learn about a few different types of circulatory system. What they all have in common is they all carry some form of fluid. Okay, they all circulate a fluid around. They then have something that contains that fluid. It may be a very complex network, it may be a very simple network, but there is something that is holding these fluids, or this fluid. And lastly, there is something to push the fluid around. Okay, there is some form of pump. And what we have, our two main types, are the open circulatory system and closed circulatory system. And whether an animal has one of those or the other relates in some way to how big the animal is and how complex the animal is. And generally, if they're larger and bigger, they tend to go more towards closed. So larger and more complex, not larger and bigger. Large, complex. And on the other side, if we get to small and simpler organisms tend to have open circulatory systems. There are, of course, always exceptions. So these guys, crabs, wasps, snails, these all have open circulatory systems. What that means? Well, first of all, what's being pumped, the fluid, is hemolymph. Okay, instead of being blood, their fluid is hemolymph. And the tubes that contains the fluid is called a sinus. Okay, like we have sinuses around our nose and in our face. Okay, that's like it's a tube. Okay, so hemolymph is pumped in sinuses. What hemolymph is, it's a mix of blood and tissue fluid. So, well, I'll talk about exactly what those are in a second. But tissue fluid is the fluid that's in between your cells. Okay, that's not blood. So it's not the red blood cells. It's very similar. Okay, think like plasma. Okay, tissue fluid is essentially like the plasma. So when you scrape your knee and you have like that slightly yellowy, goopy, sticky fluid, that's tissue fluid. And the pump for these open circulatory systems is one or more hearts. And these are also simple hearts. They're not the complex hearts that we have. And as you would expect, the pump contracts to push the fluid around. But here, when the pump relaxes, it draws the fluid back. Okay, in our body we have pumps, our one heart was 4 pumps pushing this fluid around continually. Here, you have the one pump. When you squeeze the pump, the fluid moves out, and when you relax the pump, it draws the fluid back in. Okay, so this is a diagram of an open circulatory system. I should have mentioned why it's open is because the fluid is not always contained. Okay, it's not always strictly contained within the tubes. Contained in sinuses in this case. Okay, so here we have, this is a sinus here. Here we have sinus as well. Alright, so we have valves. Remember, valves we'll learn in a later class. Make sure the blood only goes in, or the fluid only goes in one direction. And then we have the tissue cells. So these are all the different cells. So you may have like muscle cells or muscle tissues. You may have nerve tissue. Okay. But you'll notice that we don't have individual tubes going to every single tissue. Okay. It just kind of goes out into the open here. So our heart squeezes. So it contracts, becomes smaller. Hemolymph is pushed around. The valves make sure that the hemolymph only goes in one direction, and it goes and bathes all of these tissues. Okay, so we have oxygen being delivered, nutrients being taken away, all that stuff that your circulatory system does happens without having blood vessels. And then the heart is going to relax. It's going to go back to its normal shape. And just like in the respiratory system, we now have low pressure and the fluid has to return. The fluid cannot go through this way. Okay, that won't work because the valve will not allow it to. Okay, the valve is making sure the fluid can only go in that direction. So it can't go back this way. So it has to come in from the open cavities. Okay, so where the sinuses are, or where from the tissue, from the tissues. That'll go back into your heart, and then once again, when it contracts, the whole circuit will be continued. So open systems, in addition to what I just mentioned, they're typically very low pressure. Because we're not keeping the fluid strictly in those tubes, okay, we're not tightly regulating the volume. Okay, imagine if you have a bike pump and you just have it in open air, okay, or in a plastic bag, for example. When you push down the pump, the pressure isn't really high. Okay, compared to if you put it your pump connected it to your bike tire, when you have a very tightly closed tube, the pressure increases much more quickly. So open systems have very low pressure. Because of that, they're very inefficient. Okay, low pressure means a low flow rate. So it's a very slow or comparatively slow flow of the fluid. And that's usually not big a problem, or not too big a problem, because the animals which have open circulatory systems usually have very low metabolic rates. So they don't have a high demand for oxygen or for glucose. Okay, they don't produce much energy per second. And in actual fact, our open systems aren't always used for oxygen. In most cases, insects, such as this grasshopper thing down here, it actually doesn't get its oxygen from its hemolymph. Okay, it actually has a separate system of tubes that will take oxygen and deliver it through the body. You don't need to know about exactly how that happens, but understand that in some animals, actually in a lot of insects actually, the main purpose of the circulatory system is to deliver nutrients and to remove waste. I mentioned exceptions earlier. One insect that has a very high BMR is a bee. Okay, bees are very inefficient flyers, but they need to carry a lot of mass, which is themselves and then all of their pollen. So they actually have a closed circulatory system. Okay, so bee has closed because it has a high BMR. So some invertebrates, like I mentioned, so a bee, but then also squids, octopi, or octopodes, and earthworms have closed circulatory systems. Any vertebrate, so we're now talking about complex animals, we all have closed circulatory systems. You will not find a mouse or even a very small a small vertebrate with a backbone that has a open circulatory system. Okay, we are already too complex. Okay, even the smallest mouse is too large and too complex to have an open system. And the main difference here is that the fluid is contained in blood vessels. Structurally, this is the main difference. Okay, of course we also have blood and not hemolymph, but in terms of what you can see, blood vessels. So now we're separating our blood from our tissue fluid. That's a picture of an octopus. So we have our blood here. Okay, our blood is contained within these tubes. Okay, but then water, nutrients, all of that stuff can come out of the blood without going directly into cells. Okay, in between all this space, okay, going around here, maybe even going in between these cells, depending on what type of cells you have the tissue fluid. Okay, so it's like an intermediate between the cell and the blood. Okay, so not every cell comes in direct contact with the circulatory system. Okay, that's why we have the tissue fluid kind of all the way around, bathing these cells here. Okay, so that's the tissue fluid. Maybe I should write that down. In terms of what it contains, it is essentially the blood minus the cells, okay, which is basically the plasma. It's also, you could also say it's basically the cytoplasm minus all of the organelles. So in a closed system, you'll notice that the whole way around, the fluid, so the blood, is contained. It is always inside the tubes. Okay, not that all the nutrients are always contained, because we talked about the tissue fluid. Interstitial fluid is another way of saying tissue fluid. So that fluid can still be outside of the tubes, but the fluid that is pumped by the system, in this case the blood, is always contained within the tubes. So you'll notice in a earthworm, okay, that's a good example because it's a very simple organism that still has a closed circulatory system. Okay, we have several hearts here, and we have a network of blood vessels that will carry the blood all around the body. And not once will you find the blood outside of the heart or of those, or outside of those vessels. Compare that to the grasshopper, where we still have the pumps, but you'll notice that the tubes end, and the hemolymph will just go out into the tissue fluid, into the tissues. Okay, so the hemolymph is the tissue fluid, it's the same thing, before returning back to the heart. So looking at closed circulatory systems only, we can have various levels of complexity. And typically as the animal becomes more complex, so too will its circulatory system. So this can be used as evidence of common ancestry. Okay, so you'll see the more complex animals have more similarities between them. It's like mammals, birds, and crocodiles. Okay, we all have four-chambered hearts. Reptiles, slightly less complex, maybe a slightly further back for a common ancestor, have a modified three-chambered heart, and going back to fish, so way back for a common ancestor, still quite simple, they have a two-chambered heart. What you'll notice is we have a similar type of thing here. Okay, let me just try and figure out which word is which. The top, okay, at the top here we have the lungs or gills or whatever it is. It's where you go to the respiratory system. This is what I should have written, but too late. And down here you have the body. Okay, so what you'll notice is we have a heart with at least two chambers. The top one is labeled V because they have that's called a ventricle. You don't need to know about it right now. We'll look at it when we look more at the heart. But the ventricle has the job of pumping the blood out of the heart. So this goes away from the heart. And the A is the atrium, and that receives the blood from the rest of from somewhere else. So in the atrium, the blood goes into the heart, and in the ventricle, it goes out of the heart. In each case, you'll notice that the blood will go to deoxygenated blood, so low O2, will go to the gills or the lungs or whatever, that whatever structure will reoxygenate the blood. So in an animal, okay, this would be the lungs. The blood, so blue will represent deoxygenated, so low O2. It goes to the lungs, and now it picks up all that oxygen. It's now oxygenated. It has a lot of oxygen in it, and then that is going to be pumped to the rest of the body. Even in the fish, we have a similar type of thing. Low oxygenated blood goes to the lungs, becomes oxygenated, picks up all that oxygen, and then goes to the rest of the fish's body. Then it'll get used for respiration, that oxygen will be used up, and it'll have to return to the heart to be pumped again to the gills. Okay, so a similar type of thing where we're pumping away from the heart, first goes to the gills or lungs to get reoxygenated. What you'll see here though is that in amphibians, reptiles, and in mammals, that blood, once it's gone to the lungs, it goes back to the heart. Okay, from here, lungs back to heart, lungs back to heart, lungs back to the heart. And then the second part of the heart will send it around to the rest of the body. Okay, fish don't have that. They have the one pump that'll take it around the whole circuit. Okay, that lets us, as more complex animals, be more efficient. Okay, so that second pass of the heart means you can increase the pressure, send it around faster. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's slides. Hopefully you'll be able to do these things, explain why we need circulation, state the basic functions of a circulatory system, compare and contrast open and closed systems, and state that or recognize that even closed systems can vary in complexity, and briefly described how blood is pumped in a two-circuit circulatory system. So by that last bit we mean, I should have mentioned that, sorry, this is, well, we'll use this as a two-circuit system. What we mean by that, let me get rid of all this. Yep. So by that we mean we have 2 circuits, or 2 laps. So we have lap 1, where it goes from the heart. So let me write it here. Lap 1, heart to the lungs, back to the heart. Hopefully you can see that. Here we're in the heart, go to the lungs, return to the heart. Lap 2 is then, or circuit 2, sorry, is from the heart to the body, back to the heart. So we're in the heart. Let me draw this in green. In the heart, we go around to the body, and then we return back to the heart. So that's the 2 circuits. Okay, so circuit 1, make it clearer. Heart to lungs to heart. Circuit 2 is heart to body, back to the heart. Okay, and we'll look at that more in a later class when we look specifically at the heart and what it does. Okay, to test your knowledge from today's class, please complete questions 1 to 6 on page 481. Once you're done with that, you can continue your studying for your quiz in tomorrow's class. Okay, if you have any questions from today, please send me an email or write a comment on this post. You do not have homework from today's class. If you don't finish these questions in class, don't worry about it. I'd rather you prepare for your quiz. Okay, but then after you finish your quiz, try and finish off these. Okay, thanks everyone.